Good morning. Welcome to Allen Avenue Unitarian Universalist Church's worship. I'm Erica Bartlett. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the chair of the worship committee. Our mission calls us to celebrate diversity, encourage spiritual growth, and promote social responsibility while we travel on and care for the earth. Each month, Allen Avenue supports a nonprofit organization whose mission aligns with our Unitarian Universalist principles. The Share the Plate recipient for March is Amjambo Africa. Amjambo Africa serves as a conduit of information for new Mainers as they navigate life in Maine. It also includes background articles about Africa, so those from Maine can understand why newcomers have arrived here. To learn more about this organization, please go to the website linked on our order of service today. I'd also like to welcome the Reverend Molly Brewer, who's joining us via Zoom this morning and will be on the screen shortly. Reverend Molly, whose pronouns are Faye and Fair, is a Unitarian Universalist minister based in rural New Hampshire, where Faye lives with Fair's spouse and 3 cats. After being ordained by our church, A2U2, and the First Universalist Church of Auburn, Reverend Molly served as the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York, remotely as youth ministry coordinator. In addition, Reverend Molly has served as a group facilitator for the UUA's Leader Lab and for the Church of the Larger Fellowship. And Faye has preached and hosted educational workshops at UU congregations across the country. Thank you for being here, Reverend Molly. I know you're listening. And to everyone here, we're so glad you've joined us today. We will now center our hearts and minds with the ringing of the bell.
Come and be welcomed in this space, as old friend, as new seeker, as one who holds the margins of the space, or as one who occupies the center. Let your heart be compass as you locate yourself within this community. And perhaps notice if your heart is telling you that we can be all these things. You are not wrong to believe so. Let it point you to your true north, and from there, chart your next move. If you are old friend here, can you discover something new? If you are a new seeker, do you feel invited to take a place of pride here? If you are at the margin, what would call you to the center? And if you are at the center, is it time to move aside? The mystery here is in the noticing, the comparing and contrasting what we think we know with the promises we make to one another, to show up, to live with care, to include all in our understanding of divinity. The mystery is in the ways we choose to use these words as guide and heading, showing our way into a future that does not belong to us alone. Old friend, new seeker, be welcomed here. Let us worship together. I invite you to join me now in singing our first hymn, number 179, Words That We Hold Tight. invite you now to join me in lighting our chalice, the symbol of our Unitarian Universalist values, with these words from the Reverend Kate Walker. In between lighting of the match and the kindling of oil, in between choosing of text and the reading of words, in between voices and notes carried through the air into ears to hear, in between, creation thrusts ever forward. Social hierarchies may disassemble and structures may fall, communities may revolt or tempt trust, tradition may falter or creativity crashes forward, leaders may step down or take charge, the people may choose or refuse. In between, storm predicted, the horizon beckons. In between, theology of process reminds us to step back. In between, where minutiae and galaxies intermingle with microbes and mysteries, in between, liminal, that space where we wait, look, listen, feel, breathe.
Good morning. I'm Steve Hanson, a member of the annual Pledge Drive team. Each week the Pledge Drive has a theme, and this week's theme is responding to adversity. This was a hard one to find something to talk about, which seems uplifting, by the way. In 1994, I lived in Los Angeles, and one January morning at 4:30 a.m., we were shaken out of our beds by the Northridge earthquake. Other than losing some dishes, the only big thing that happened was our fence fell down. However, we did spend the time till sunrise sitting on the porch, covered in blankets, dealing with the aftershocks, which was pretty scary. However, you can only sit on the porch so long. After sunrise, we actually started to get hungry, and we realized that turning on the gas stove was probably not a good idea. And so we did what you can do in Los Angeles. We got out our barbecue, and we started to cook up breakfast. And what was interesting is that our neighbors noticed the smell, and they're in the same position, so they all got their barbecues out also. And so what we did was we actually started a big block party, which continued on for a couple of hours. Once we got rid of the coffee, we switched to beer around noon, and it seemed like a really good idea to burn that fence of ours and make a big bonfire. And so what was interesting, though, is the earthquake had just happened, and the firefighters were on the lookout for smoke. So we actually attracted a firefighter and a couple of police cars who gave us what I would call a very minimal scolding, because we were sitting there with a lot of food. And so we fed all the firefighters, we fed the police officers, and they attracted more police officers, and eventually we kind of ran out of food. So the response to the earthquake had actually a fairly long-run effect. We had an annual community barbecue where the police officers and the firefighters were invited. So last 2 years, our congregation has definitely had adversity. And I think that one thing that I really would like us to have is a barbecue this summer, which we'll see if we can pull it off, okay? And to paraphrase Molly Brewer's upcoming sermon, I think in case of emergency, clink glasses.
Good morning. My name's Troy Moon. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees, and so when Steve asked me to do a testimonial about what A2U2 means to me, I thought, great, that should be pretty easy. Then he said you have 2 minutes, so it got a little tougher. But my family and I have been involved with the church for many years, so I asked myself, what's the one most important thing I can hit on in 2 minutes? After some reflection, what I'm most grateful for is the support the A2U2 community has given to our family and our kiddo Tegan as they grew up, came of age, and have now gone off to college. Some of you know Tegan. They're thoughtful, creative, and don't usually follow the path of least resistance for anything. That's definitely created some challenges for them along the way, and they often struggled with social life in school. But Tegan always felt safe and accepted and loved here at A2U2. They grew up in the RE program from early childhood all the way through senior youth group. And I'm immensely grateful to all of the adult leaders who shared their time and understanding and who no doubt spent a lot of time listening to Tegan tell stories and explain things. I think it's really important that kids have adult mentors outside of the family who can give them insight, advice, or just be good listeners. At A2U2, we are fortunate to have many wonderful people who are willing to fill that role. For Tegan, there have been several folks who have been there and offered exactly what they needed when they needed it. So how amazing is it that Tegan had the opportunity to be matched with Betsy Parsons for coming of age? For a young person working to find their identity, it was a remarkable opportunity. An immense thanks to all the senior youth leaders who supported Tegan through high school. Tegan always looked forward to the activities and retreats, and it was amazing to have a leader like Mark Chimsky who was able to show Tegan that there are great opportunities for creative people who dedicate themselves to their craft. And even outside our formal programs, adults like Catherine Falwell took on the role of mentor, and Catherine continues to coach Tegan as a young professional artist. So for this loving and accepting community, I am most grateful. Thanks.
So, I am going to admit that I am a little unclear as to whether we have any children in the sanctuary this morning, because I can't quite see from the camera angle. But whether you are young or just feeling young at heart, I would invite you now to sort of tap into that curious spirit as we do our time for all ages. This is adapted by my colleague, the Reverend Karen G. Johnson, from Congressman John Lewis's memoir. This true story comes to us from John Lewis, who was a great leader in this nation, who died in July 2020. Many people were sad to lose him and thankful for everything that he did during his life to bring about justice in our country. He lived a long and full life, asking of himself and asking all of us to show up for justice, to do what we can, and just a little bit more, to make sure that there is more fairness in our country and in our world. John Lewis grew up in a large family, and he would spend time with his aunts or uncles, with his siblings and cousins. And there were many children in the neighborhood, so they would play together. This was long before the pandemic, so it was easy for people to play together and hang out together. It could happen all on its own, and it didn't really need a plan. Mr. Lewis, in the book that he wrote about his life, tells us about a time when he was playing outside his Aunt Seneva's house with about 14 other children when a big storm arrived, a kind of storm that made him very afraid. I'm going to tell the story from his perspective, so it's like he's talking. So when I say I, it really means Mr. John Lewis. Aunt Seneva was the only adult around, and as the sky blackened and the wind grew stronger, she herded us all inside. Her house was not the biggest place around, and it seemed even smaller with so many children all squeezed inside. Small and surprisingly quiet. All of the shouting and laughter that had been going on earlier outside had stopped. The wind was howling now, and the house was starting to shake. We were scared. Even Aunt Seneva was scared. And then it got worse. Now the house was beginning to sway. The wood plank flooring beneath us began to bend, and then a corner of the room started lifting up. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. None of us could. The storm was actually pulling the house toward the sky with us inside it. That was when Aunt Seneva told us to clasp hands. "Line up and hold hands," she said, and we did as we were told. Then she had us walk, as a group, toward the corner of the room that was rising. From the outside, sheets of rain started beating on the tin roof, and then we walked back in the other direction as another end of the house began to lift. And so it went, back and forth, 15 children walking with the wind, holding that trembling house down with the weight of our small bodies. Can you imagine what it was like to be inside of that house? Afraid that it might fall all apart from the destructive force of the wind and the rain, from the whole storm. I am so glad that John Lewis wasn't alone, that he was there with his friends and family, and I am glad that they figured out a way to work together. When John Lewis was much older and was writing down the story of his whole astounding life, he wrote these words: "More than half a century has passed since that day, and it has struck me more than once over those many years that our society is not unlike the children in that house, rocked again and again by the winds of one storm or another, the walls around us seeming at times as if they might fly apart. It seemed that way in the 1960s at the height of the civil rights movement, when America itself felt as if it might burst at the seams, so much tension, so many storms. But the people of conscience never left the house. They never ran away. They stayed, they came together, and they did the best they could, clasping hands and moving toward the corner of the house that was the weakest. And then another corner would lift, and we would go there. And eventually, inevitably, the storm would settle, and the house would still stand. But we knew another storm would come, and we would have to do it all over again. And we did, and we still do, all of us, you and I. Children holding hands, walking with the wind. And so my question to all of you who are there today in the sanctuary in Portland, where do we need to move next? And how do we know where to go?
Each week, our staff and volunteers create meaningful spiritual experiences. We have religious education programming, spiritual enrichment groups, and a variety of opportunities to create community. The funds we receive support all that we do, and 1/3 will be shared with Umjambo Africa. There is a QR code on the back of the problem if you'd like to donate electronically, or you can wait for the plates to come around. This morning's offering will now be gratefully received. This reading, titled I Say It Touches Us, is by the Reverend Dr. Marnie Harmony. I say it touches us that our blood is seawater and our tears are salt, that the sea of our bodies is scarcely different from the same cells in a seaweed, and that the stuff of our bones is like the coral. I say that the tide rolls in on us, whether we like it or no, and the sands of time keep running their intended course. I say we have to go down into the wave's trough to find ourselves, and ride her swell until we can see beyond ourselves, into our neighbor's eye. I say that we shall never leave the harbor if we do not hoist the sail. I say we have got to travel the waves as well as solid ground. I say that anyone who goes without consciousness of this will remain chained to a rusty anchor. May the voyage find us worthy. May the voyage make us glad.
Right now, I'm going to level with you. It is a hard and weird time to be a storyteller. I am not talking about the kind of storytelling that we want to do when we feel like escaping. That kind of fictional, comforting storytelling is alive and well, and in some ways easier now than it has been for a long time. But being a storyteller of the real, trying to pull together the threads of what we see in front of us and weave it into a cohesive picture to try and shape a narrative of the time we're living right now, that is very hard. And because we are all storytellers, I suspect many of you are feeling it too. It's hard because the story that we're living, the one I keep seeing in front of me, is one of deep disconnection. War, increasing income inequality, disparity in access to healthcare, legislative danger to queer and trans kids are just a few examples. But I don't exactly have to search far and wide for this to be the prevailing story that I am experiencing right now. And all the while, the pandemic is still going on, and the relaxing and removal of mask mandates is making public life increasingly unsafe again for a lot of the folks who never stopped being at high risk of complications and long-ranging effects from the virus. Weaving together a story that tells us about transcending ourselves, reaching out for one another across barriers, and recognizing that together is the only way we can make it through, gets very hard when we're all having such different experiences of this time. But one thing that I know we all have in common, whether you are me here in New Hampshire or all of you sitting there in the sanctuary in Portland, is that we are all part of this community. All of us, including me, have been touched by it and care deeply about its future, which is, of course, our future as well. To be clear, this is not a sermon that I could easily pack up and take on the road and deliver just anywhere, because the nature of our relationship is enduring. This congregation, one of the two churches that ordained me to ministry, is where I grew into myself as not just a spiritual person, but a Unitarian Universalist. It's where I began to experience a sense of what was possible, not just for me personally, but for us as a people and a tradition that seeks to grow and understand not only ourselves, but our place in the world, and which uses that understanding to foster seeds of justice and liberation in a world beset by larger systems that commodify and limit us. And I know that right now, we are going through a transition in terms of how we think about ministry and its role in our congregation and lives. What does it mean right now to trust one another, to communicate with openness and honesty? What can we be reasonably expected to promise to one another in this time? And what happens when and if those promises are broken? I want to be really plain when I say that these kinds of existential questions are coming up in almost every UU congregation right now. A2U2 is not unique in this. The pandemic has created huge change in everyone's lives and continues to cause change. In most cases, it wasn't and still isn't change any of us were ready to roll with or navigate gracefully. And with the stress and upheaval of that change, our UU congregations all over the country are starting to see the places where their existing covenants, their promises to one another about how to be and behave, are not sufficient to this moment. This is as true in Portland as it is in New Hampshire, in Florida, Indiana, Texas, Hawaii, and beyond. Our congregations all asking these same questions and wrestling with these issues. Wherever we are, we're starting to perceive cracks in the foundations that we've built. Amid this story of disconnection, trust in one another is eroding. Our communication becomes loaded and difficult. And because none of us are communicating or navigating relationships at the top of our game, we disappoint one another or fall short of our own and others' expectations, and trust erodes further. When we are in a position of needing to constantly roll with change, of walking with the wind to adapt to new conditions, as our story from Congressman John Lewis taught us this morning, knowing where to look for guidance, how to prioritize our next action is essential. If you have ever gone into a crowded, sprawling shopping mall complex where everything looks simultaneously exactly the same everywhere and yet somehow impossible to figure out where you're heading, it's really common to find near the entrances those big boards that tell you you are here. Knowing where we are now helps us translate the signs that we see around us and figure out the direction that we head in order to get to where we want to be. We can think of covenant in this way, as a point to begin from. For many congregations here in Maine and in our larger UU world, covenants are seen as something we don't really need. After all, if we are all coming into this space in good faith, why should we need to define how we can be together? Why wouldn't we just get along all the time, and then when disagreement comes up, we navigate it then? Sometimes, if a congregation is particularly prescient or has experience that necessitated such a thing in the past, it might even create a covenant that's intended to be used specifically in situations of conflict. In other words, a relational emergency. It's the proverbial fire axe in case of emergency break glass container. With such an association, why wouldn't anyone be a little afraid of having one? It's a little like admitting defeat before we even begin, right? The fact is, a covenant isn't just a set of rules that tell us what we can and can't do or say in each other's company. It can contain that, but it is more than that. Like our principles and our mission statement, a covenant is a record of our aspirations, our hopes for the kind of community that we want to be. It's not just a relic for when we're really in it and need to fight it out. It is a living thing that points us to our most cherished, shared ideals of who we want to become. When we pay attention to things like the promises we make to one another, and when we do this regularly, we stay in alignment with the idea of the community we want to become, that we are always growing into becoming. Our heading is clear, and the place we're aimed is also the place we want to be going. But the nature of living in the world in the early 2020s, with its barrage of challenges on emotional, mental, social, even physical and financial fronts, has caused that exact relational emergency I mentioned before for everyone. Nobody caused this. It's nobody's fault. And it just goes to show that no matter how good our intentions, we may one day need to use that emergency tool. And then, when we need to break the glass where we keep the covenant, that's designed for getting us through just these kinds of situations. We find that the tool, because we treated it as an emergency need rather than a living record of the ways we agree to be in relationship, can no longer guide us as effectively as we might hope. However, when we think of the promises we make and continue making to one another as a living and evolving thing, we can start to see it as a key to a courageous imagination of who we might become and the ways we might be of service to one another and the world. I am thinking of the radical ways UU churches are reimagining their spaces in light of the desires arising within their communities. And I'm not saying that we need to completely renovate our space, but it is one example of looking at the thing that we once thought was completely impossible to do. Some are expanding, making sure that their people have safety and space in this pandemic, post-pandemic, mid-pandemic world. Others are noticing how little they truly need their buildings, or seeing places where their long-loved resources can be of more immediate use. I'm thinking right now of the other church that ordained me to ministry in Auburn, using its space as a warming shelter for unhoused people in the city and meeting this great need in their community. But to do this, to do something like it, and to do it in a way that feels purposeful and intentional, we need to be in candid and accountable communication about the deepest desires we have for our communities. This is where we need to be paying close attention to the things that are emerging, both within ourselves and the community and around us. New feelings, new senses of identity, new priorities and ideas, not just of who we were, but who we want to be. The relationships we have with ourselves have changed. The ones we have with others may have changed. Even the way we as Unitarian Universalists relate to our faith has changed and continues to change. And it is this last piece of change I am interested in paying close attention to right now. Our faith historically has been one of continuous self-improvement. Sometimes that shows up as a highly individualized journey where we seek our own truth and we see our community, our church or our congregation, as a means of support while we do so. This has worked for a time, and it fit a very specific cultural moment when it was rare and sometimes difficult to find accepting communities for shared thought and exploration. And over time, options for finding that kind of friendship and connection have broadened and diversified. So why make the choice to keep coming back to religious community beyond habit? What do we stand to gain from it that we can't get in other places? In our current cultural moment, where we're beginning to see the collapse of systems and institutions that once were capable of helping many, we as human beings are seeking deep wisdom and deep connection in communities where the promises we make to each other count and can be counted on. Because we are all storytellers, and now is a hard time for storytellers, we seek a countervailing narrative to the story of alienation and disconnection that's being told around us. People coming together and loving one another, making promises, disappointing each other, and then mending again is a story of endurance. And we long to see a reality where making a mistake does not have to be the end of the story. We long for a more just world, and the way we begin that work is by forging real relationships with marginalized people speaking about their experiences in the world. We seek places where we can grow into ourselves and be in right relationship to one another. We seek multi-generational spaces, increasingly rare, where we're reminded not only of the teachings being passed down to us from prior generations, but of our own responsibilities to those who come after. And above all, we want these spaces to be courageously and radically imagined. We want a living, breathing model of a world where all are valued for what they bring, who they are, the unique contribution they make to the mosaic of humanity. This space of being liminal between, in the midst of a journey that's already haltingly begun, is in many ways an inherently uncomfortable one. Nothing now is the same as it was 2 years ago. Even though some, and I will remind us that it's still only some, not all, are able to come out into this wider open space and greet one another with less fear than we had at that time 2 years ago, we are still operating at sea with no visible landmarks. And I think some of us, I know this is true of me, really wish we had something solid and reliable to use as a guide. In the practice, history, and theology of Unitarian Universalism, the promises we make to one another, the covenants we hold to, the things and relationships that we commit to, are meant to be precisely that solid, reliable guide. With the shores of the familiar far behind us, and knowing that wherever we end up next may not require the same rules or understandings we used to navigate before, our task becomes looking to less familiar places for guidance as to where we should be heading. Which senses are most reliable as guides in this new place, this changed reality? What knowledge from the world before no longer applies to this new situation and circumstance? And where are the relationships we can trust to grow and change along with us that aren't constrained by ideas of who and how we once were? The Reverend Dr. Marnie Harmony in today's reading reminds us that we are all of a piece. Our bones coral, our blood seawater, and that this experience of riding the waves, being in this liminal space between, is a necessary part of being human. Anyone who goes without consciousness of this, she says, will remain chained to a rusty anchor. There may be, I sense, some part of that anchor still holding back many of our communities from imagining and realizing the fullness of what they can offer to the world. Does the voyage find us worthy? Will the voyage make us glad? I believe that it does, and it will. I believe that in our voyaging, there is so much more goodness that awaits us. And I believe that the promises we make to each other, the agreements to trust, to speak in love, to listen and learn, are the compass and the stars that guide us to a home we have not yet seen. Let us then find our heading, move with the wind and the waves, and journey forward. I invite you now to join us in our closing hymn, number 1064, Blue Boat Home. As we extinguish our chalice today, I leave you with these words from Rick Hoyt. Go forth, because we are always going forth from somewhere. Going from our homes, our childhoods, going from our cities and countries, going from innocence to experience to enlightenment. Going into mystery and questions, going into the desert, getting to the other side. Go forth, leave behind the comfort and community of one place, head into the anxiety and loneliness of another. Carry with you all of the love and laughter of this place and let it light your way. Carry with you the wisdom you learned and the good memories. May they give you strength for your journey. And when you have been away long enough, far enough, done what you'd set off to do, been there so long that place too starts to feel like home, come back. Come back to the one universal, everywhere and every when and everyone inclusive home. This beloved community of all creation that you can never really leave. Amen. Blessed be.